She is going to be presenting on, and you changed the title a little bit just to keep me on my toes. Initially, gender and work myths versus reality, and now they're and things to ponder. So there we go.
The political news today made me add that piece.
Okay, all right. So we will be working through some important questions together and figuring them out and muddling them through. For those of you who don't yet know Dr. Mukherjee, she is a highly valued and a really versatile member of the faculty at St. Ben's and St. John's. She is the chair of the economics department. She is also affiliate faculty of Asian Studies and of Gender Studies. So that's a lot of hats to wear, and she wears them with grace. She has contributed her time to gender studies since your beginning here, I think. She oftentimes teaches Gender 101 for us, our Introduction to Gender Studies class. She long served on our Gender Studies Steering Committee until I suggested that she was a little overcommitted and she could take a couple of years break. She is hopefully developing, fingers crossed, a course on the political economy of race and gender, which will count for both economics and for gender studies. In addition, she is asked to serve on many important institutional committees because her expertise is so valued. So she has served on the Faculty Senate. She has served on the St. Ben's and St. John's Rank and Tenure Committee, and she was part of the search team for our interim president at St. John's University. Dr. Mukherjee earned her PhD in economics at UC Riverside in 2007. Her three areas of research are development economics, Asian economies, and feminist economics. The talk today is going to be building on one of those three areas of research of hers. She's going to be addressing the impacts of gender and race inequality in labor markets and drawing the connections between these inequalities in a number of different issues, including being a mother and the impact of that and of childcare or lack thereof on women's employment, and also connecting it to declining fertility rates in the United States, which is a problem not just in the US, but nationally and internationally, I want to say. What I especially appreciate about her research is she gives us the economic analysis tools to understand what is going on, and she doesn't just kind of stop there, but she also makes policy recommendations. So how can we change things and make them better? Just to give you a little sense of her versatility of her research, which is as versatile as her contributions to St. Ben's and St. John's, her other kind of major area of research is on India, because remember I said she does work on development economics and Asian economies. She has doing research on some preference in sex ratio imbalance in India and examining whether women's empowerment and women's activity in the labor market, whether that affects those ratios. So she does work here within the United States context and also the international context. Really exciting and really hard to wear both those hats, and she does both of those things. She has a dozen publications on these and other related topics in areas of journals a wide range of journals, including things like the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, Feminist Economics, and the Journal of International Research and Business Practice, as well as many, many, many conference presentations. We are really fortunate to have Dr. Mukherjee on our faculty here at St. Ben's, St. John's, to have her in gender studies making the contributions she makes to our program, and to have her here this afternoon to share what she knows and help give us a few things to ponder. So thank you, and can you help me welcome her?
Jean, she is too kind. And thank all of you, and I'm really nervous because I was kind of prepared for two people. And then, but of course I'm glad you're here, and I'm thankful to students who, some of who I know, some of who I don't. I know it's always a stretch to come to something after classes, after class time. Thank you to my faculty colleagues. I know those of you who are, and thank you to some of who don't have to be here, but are here. Some of my staff colleagues, my faculty colleagues, and some of you who are currently here, because I know it's advising season, and so it's exhausting to be in another activity after classes. So hopefully I can make your time worthwhile. I have not tailored this to be something super complicated and academic. I mean, I said complicated and academic together, so that sometimes might suggest that academic things are a little bit out of there. This is a topic, as Jean pointed out, it's kind of at the crux of who I am as a human being, a woman, a mother, a teacher, and a part of it is I'm glad to see so many of you here because this is something which has affected us as a society here in the United States and around the world for several years. And it's up to you, your generation in many ways, to see if we can change it. And we can pave things for a collective future. I'm glad that there are people of all genders here because one of the things that I'd like to point out that this is not something which affects one gender. It is something that is honestly a social problem, and I don't think any one part of society can address it independently. The other piece is I did, as Jean pointed out, when I kind of was finishing grad school or going to grad school, my interests were on India, and I was kind of, grad school gives you a narrow focus, and I was narrowly focused on gender issues there. As an economist, I was primarily, I still am an economist, but I was kind of focused on economic relationships and primarily the data. But at UC Riverside, I suddenly, once I ran my regressions, got my results, the puzzling piece of what I noticed, and which I'll talk about today as well, and this was relative to India, I noticed that as areas become richer or women get more educated, it seems that the bias intensifies. And initially I was like, this is wrong, something's wrong in my data set, or something's wrong in my regression results. And of course it wasn't. It was, and then I realized that the answers to these questions will not come from economics or the data alone. And I grew frustrated and I said, I want to shift to women's studies, as it was called, and gender studies. And I took some classes, and then my teachers and my dad, who passed away last year, kind of convinced me that you have to have economics as your home, but you can understand these issues better. So when I took classes in the gender studies department, that's when I kind of broadened my outlook, and I kind of understood the why. The economics could tell me what is, but the deeper understandings of why people behave the way they behave, a lot of that came from gender studies. And that's why at CSBSJU, I think it's a perfect place for us to kind of work, because we get to work with so many sides, and it's in understanding all of these sides that help you create solutions. So my hope will be for all of you, when you go, you have something to think about, and hopefully some solutions which come out of today, and maybe you decide how to act, how to address this issue. So, I'm not very good at Kahoot, but I've designed it a few times, and I designed a game for us, if I can only find it. And so, those of you who are comfortable, how many of you have used Kahoot before? Okay, that's a sizable percent. And I did test it out with my daughter and somebody else. She's in the 7th grade, and she's like, I don't want to do this Kahoot. What is it even saying? She might pop in at some point, because, and so I would like you, if you haven't used Kahoot before, to, I guess you kind of go to this website and let us, I'm a little shaky because I came here a little early, and my computer wasn't working, and thankfully now, thanks to Fantastic ID, it is working. So was caught a little off guard, and so I guess that's what I have to do. And it will load a game pin, which I will request you to and then we won't play the Kahoot all together. So I will start once all of you have signed on with that particular game pin. Are you able to get on it? I guess I can even see if you have.
Yeah, look at all those names popping up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's kind of cool. Okay, so our topic, of course, is women, work, and we'll start off with some, like I said, as we walk through these questions, we will hopefully, maybe all of you are going to get 100%, I don't know, but it's going to help me understand what we already know. So I'm assuming everybody's in. I don't want to leave anybody behind. Okay, so I'm going to get started. We'll do one question at a time. Okay, come on. Okay, great. For some reason it has a Halloween theme. I did not choose it.
Can we ask what you mean by work? You mean outside the home, or do you include inside the home?
Sheila, you're stealing my thunder. Sheila is a sociologist and she's a pro, and she.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. That's exactly the question that should have been in people's mind, and I think most of you got that correct. So, and let's start with Sheila's question. So men work longer hours than women, and of course I didn't clarify what work means. To me, as an economist, if you would have asked that question, I would have said, yeah, men work longer. However, if you kind of look into this, work as it's defined is using skills, using resources, that is time, in order to produce output. And clearly when we start with the idea of work, we find that around the world, women, and of course, here, let me clarify for those of you who are students and scholars in gender studies, of course there is this piece about men, women, and genders. We know that men and women are gendered categories, but when data sources sometimes provide data, they talk about women and men rather loosely to mean the binary between males and females. So that is not technically correct, but I would say that when data sources collect data, there is, of course, very little data on the community of humans who identify as neither men nor women. So usually it's kind of loosely based on the notion of a binary. And since I'm going to talk a lot about data, I am going to again talk about women according to that loose category, knowing that data sources typically do not classify. And here you definitely see that men and women women work much longer hours. And you also see that in developing countries, that the amount of unpaid work, Sheila of course asked the important question, that work doesn't have to be paid. And when you factor in the notion of unpaid work, particularly in developing countries, also in developed countries, you do see that women work for much longer hours. And so, actually, when these were some of the images, I was trying to find a kind of cool background, but I decided to not use any of these. So when you Google, my first set of images were these. And so, of course, you can understand that women's work is pretty much very entwined with paid as well as unpaid work. And so, in fact, I don't know if you can see the numbers. If you look at, and these are the minutes per day that are spent in, and I hear again, because the issue of paid work or unpaid work is also very, very different according to different countries, in the sense that developed countries, again, I wouldn't say developed countries generally have higher amounts of paid work, but on an average, many of the services that women in developing countries have to do themselves are sometimes marketable, and you can buy those things from the market in developed countries, which is why you can sometimes see that in developed countries the amount of work, time spent in paid work is a little bit higher. So I've taken countries which are kind of similar, so I've taken the United States, United Kingdom, Sweden, and so on, and you do see that the total amount of work is higher for men, higher for women, but of course paid work is definitely higher for women as a group, even in developed countries. We're going to focus on the United States. That's where we are, and that's and because the issue of women's work is so cultural as to how much of paid and unpaid work women do, it's kind of it's useful to keep that space as homogeneous as possible. Though the United States definitely is not homogeneous, but we'll focus on the United States. Okay, and we will start off with this discussion of the gender pay gap, or the gender wage gap as it's sometimes called. And loosely it refers to, again, the exact amount may sometimes be different depending on whether you're taking weekly wages, you're taking hourly wages, you're looking at income. So those metrics will change the exact number. But my question in my next Kahoot for you will be this. Has the gender pay gap been declining steadily?
Can you put up the page that has the Kahoot? Because we just can't. We just
Oh,
can't see
sorry.
it. Yeah, that's okay.
And why is that the case? I'm so sorry. Why won't it cooperate with me? Okay, sorry. And now my question is gone. Can I go back to the question? I don't know. Do I have to start this again?
I don't think you want to exit.
Oh, there you go.
Next, hit the next.
No, but I don't
Yeah.
want. I don't want the next. Were you able to?
Oh, okay, there, the answers are coming.
Yeah, but then I think the time for it was over already, because for some reason you can't see the screen unless if I'm on a full screen mode. So anyway, I'm sorry if all of you could not click on it, but the gender pay gap, what has been happening to that over time? In fact, and also I have a related question, and this time I will make sure that you can see. That is, what is the gender wage gap, gender pay gap? And it'll show you a bunch of choices. So remember. Well, let's look at it. And here we're looking at full-time salaried workers in the United States. And we kind of see, of course, the first question. Yes, there was so the gender pay gap, again, defined as the ratio of female to male wages among full-time salaried workers. And these are, again, annual averages, so it's kind of big, and I will go into details of that piece. And you do see that there were rapid strides made in equalizing that gender pay gap in the 1980s, but you do see that since the 2000s, you pretty much, or even the 1990s, you pretty much see that the gender wage gap has kind of been in that static level. It hasn't, it's kind of hovered between 80 to 83%, which is why the correct answer was 82.4%, slightly different last year, so on and so forth. So there is therefore a sustained gap in the wages, in gender wages in the United States. Now, when we make that blanket statement, of course, it hides several differences, which and therefore we must be pretty careful. It's not really one number. So let me ask you, Who do you think has a bigger gender wage gap? Younger women, older women? Who faces a bigger gender wage gap? And the faculty are not allowed to speak. What do you think? Does it increase with age? Decrease with age? Come on. Increases with age. You are correct in terms of that. And so you do see that particularly below the age of 35, the gender wage gap is kind of low, and we'll talk about why that's the case. Above the age of 35, the gender wage gap progressively increases. What about race? And let's see what you feel about, again, the gender wage gap by race. Okay, I'm becoming a pro at this, so now you can see the questions. So, Christy, maybe I should have restricted this, but okay. Who is it the highest among? Which of the big racial groups in the United States? Really? None of you got the right answer yet? Well, the gender wage gap is actually the highest among Asians, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? But then you have to understand, of course, therefore, how are we looking at this? We're not looking at the, first of all, income inequality is pretty stark in the United States with the income levels among Asians being the highest, followed by white and then black, then Hispanic, then black. However, we're talking about the gap, and we're talking about the gap between the wages of an Asian man and an Asian woman, and that gap is highest. It's kind of puzzling, right? Where you actually see that among black and Hispanic groups in the United States, the gender wage gap is relatively low. And any clues about that? Okay, maybe we'll find some clues by the end of the class. So, if you compare it with, so compared to an Asian man, an Asian woman makes substantially less than you would compare with black and Hispanic groups, and of course the white group falling somewhere in between, and that is a puzzle. Hopefully that puzzle will be solved by the time we are done with this presentation. So, so one of the things that, because this is an educational institution, in particular we are holding this presentation at the College of St. Benedict, which is a college for women. So one of the things, people identifying as women, one of the things that traditional economic theory often points out is women are less because they have less human capital. They have less skills, and we kind of think that more skills will lead to more resources. And so I think this may be my second last question for you, but just curious. Come on, beat Christy. The number of men getting bachelor's degrees for every 100 such women. It's interesting that nobody thought it was 102, which is kind of, it's sad, but we all know that more women get out of college with completed degrees compared to men. However, many of you thought that the number was slightly closer than it is, and the correct answer, of course, is 74. And so we won't spend a lot of time talking about this particular gender wage gap, but it's important to understand that in the US economy today, on an average, women have more skills than men. And let me show you. So in terms of, if you look at all of the higher degrees above high school, you do see that there are more women with each of those degree levels compared to men. So women clearly have more skills. If you look at this further, in fact, at all levels, again, it's pretty much the same thing, but kind of telling you that more women compared to men attend college and earn undergraduate degrees. In fact, what's also true is more women actually graduate at every level, whether it's 4 years or 5 years, and so on and so forth. At every level of graduation, there are more women graduating from college than men do. Now, this is important because this reflects a growth and an achievement really for women distinctly since the 1970s, because you notice that there was a 12% gap. So women have made strides in the economy, but the unfortunate part in the US economy today, of course, is the reverse gender gap in education. But we don't have time. It's something that we again, like I said, we don't want this to be all of these issues to pertain to one gender or the other. So we want to talk about common gender gaps that we experience as a society, because too often do we find gender gaps kind of pitting genders against each other. So I hope my goal in here is to say that these are common issues which all of us have to think about. Now, of course, why are there fewer men graduating from college and at every level of education is the topic of a separate discussion, but it's an important topic. Coming back to our main point, we do see that the issue is not human capital. So it's not that women are kind of lagging behind because they don't have skills, because it's clear that they have skills at every level of education. In fact, we actually see these skills do not really translate to greater income or greater wages. In fact, what you do see that even after, of course, you do see that women, and this is income, so it's not wage, so of course the numbers, and income does include things like earnings from the share market or other kinds of assets and property ownership. So the notion of income is a little different from wage, which is why you might see these numbers different. So income, and of course, you know that there is a gap in participating in financial markets, that's stocks and shares. There's a gap in asset ownership that affects overall income, which makes it different. But you do see that women do, as women get more education, their median income as a percentage of men, that keeps creeping up, but it's not necessarily consistent. And you also see that women with professional degrees only have about 50% of income as men do. So, last question to you, and that doesn't mean that I'm stopping there, but my last question in my Kahoot is, okay,
Can you put it on the screen?
oh yeah. This is kind of weird. Hold on. Almost had it. Okay. I'm sorry. That's me. I'm sure many more. Okay, but I can. How many people were going to choose the green button? And you couldn't because of time. Okay, Kathy, you counted. Women are in professions, so clearly the problem in the US economy today is not an issue of skill formation, but of course an issue of being participating in different occupations, and you definitely see that men and women do different things in the economy. I just have a snapshot in there, but definitely again you have more women in service occupation, professional occupations, and so on and so forth. But we always kind of think professional occupations are the ones that pay more money. So there are more women in professional as well as service occupations. Shouldn't they be making more money? Well, we have to kind of think about occupations as a category, and here I have a snapshot, because if you would actually go to the BLS website, you would actually, and you can click on those links, and if you want, I can share that presentation with you. you do see that within every category of those occupations there is, first of all, in the economy, you have what is called horizontal segregation. So a horizontal segregation in simple language means that men and women do different things in the economy. And this is just a snapshot. There are many more jobs included and many more career professions included in that whole list. And you kind of see that within every occupation, whether, can you notice a trend? Because it's the reason why I put in those numbers. What do you observe? So there are more women in law, but there are more paralegals. There are more women in health, but fewer doctors who are highest paid. And there are more women in professional careers and management careers, but fewer chief executives and operations managers and more human resources. And this kind of points to the idea of vertical segregation. That is, men and women do different things in the economy, and then within careers, men and women have different roles in an organization. So you kind of see clearly that the gender wage gap is kind of low among lawyers, lower among lawyers, but it's still kind of 83%. And you sort of see that the gender wage gap is kind of low among elementary and middle school teachers. It's still 86%. You also see that registered nurses, which is a female-dominated occupation, which also has a pretty high gender wage gap. So I'm not dissecting the different kind of occupations here, but one of the things that, this is something else to add, and I'll hopefully bring it together, that you have more women across occupations who are working part-time. So you kind of see, if you bring all of this data together, first of all, you see that there are high-paying occupations, such as CEOs, for example, which have pretty big gender wage gap. There aren't enough female CEOs. There are some STEM occupations, on the other hand, and this graph is really, really tiny. I was hoping the AACU would have something newer, but they didn't. And so if you could actually read the graph, you would see that in many STEM disciplines, and this is probably something that even I can't read right now, that my lenses are blurry, but then a lot of STEM disciplines like scientists, for example, women working in the NASA, for example. So you kind of find that the gender wage gap is lower. Computer science is another area. The gender wage gap is lower, but you have fewer women participating. And then you also see that there are some professions such as human resource management or paralegals or and then other sort of clerical jobs, for example, which have lower gender wage gaps. And then you also kind of see that more women work part-time. So if you were to kind of think about the gender wage gap, it's a summation of all of these different elements that you see. That women are simply not there in high-paying occupations which have low gender wage gap, namely STEM occupations. There are certain high-paying occupations such as CEOs and surgeons, and criminal lawyers, for example, where there are big gender wage gaps. And there are some low-paying occupations, such as hospitality staff or people working in retail, for example, which have lower gender wage gaps, and a larger percentage of women work part-time. So when you think of the gender wage gap, all of those pieces play a role. However, I think the important questions are, why do certain female-dominated occupations get low wages? Unfortunately, so for example, why do preschool teachers, who are predominantly women, earn less money compared to financial analysts? Any answers? Because they do, substantially less. But a preschool teacher or a daycare provider takes care of people's children, the most important possession. So why would you pay somebody more to take care of your portfolio rather than your children? I don't honestly have an answer, but that is an important question to think about. Why do certain and female-dominated occupations have low wages? Why do we have horizontal segregation? Why is it that men and women do different things in society? Are they inherently better? Do they have some sort of comparative advantage? Why do we have so few female leaders? Why are there fewer women on the top of the ladder? So for example, I'll come to the leadership question in a little bit. So the answer, I don't have an answer to the first question, because honestly, economic theory can talk about the determination of wages by looking at demand and supply, but honestly, there is a childcare gap in the society today. There is a lot of demand for childcare, but are the wages of childcare workers going up? I don't think so, not anytime soon. So you can't really explain it with the forces of demand and supply. But something is true is, as a society, we value certain kinds of emotional labor less than other kinds of emotional labor. And emotional labor broadly is the certain professions which are female dominated and male dominated, workers bring their emotions into the picture. So I'm having a bad day, but I can't take it out on students in the class, right? I still have to smile, and I'm actually privileged because I am a college teacher. Think about a preschool teacher, screaming teenagers, screaming little toddlers everywhere, but you have to smile. Or think about a flight attendant or someone who serves tables. You can't really so you have to, so emotional labor, and women are engaged in occupations with emotional labor, and often the labor they do is they're expected to do because they're women. So you're a woman, you need to be smiling and feminine, and if you are a receptionist, but then men do emotional labor as well, if you are a criminal lawyer or if you are a stern CEO, but somehow we value emotions differently in society. And that's important. Why do we do it? That's a question to answer, but we do. Why is there occupational segregation? I think that question is particularly important because when you look at St. Ben's and St. John's as college campuses, you all know that our majors are heavily gendered, right? You know which are the majors big in St. Ben's, and you know which are the majors that are big in St. John's. And I've often thought about that question because, again, I am actually the chair of a department where for a while I was the only woman in the department, and we have very few very bright female majors. And so, but the question is, why is it? Are men and women? And again, there's a big literature, and I'm not going to go into that piece. But it is widely understood that that it's not really about abilities, and there's no evidence. However, attitudes across the board, attitudes which are formed way before students even come to college, starting from preschool. For example, one of the big pieces of success in STEM depends upon math anxiety, which again is notably high. Anxiety with relate to grades and those pieces, again, substantially higher for women than men. And then those are kind of complicated issues and maybe for another day. But what's important again is if attitudes are at the base of why men and women are doing different things, then probably there's some work to be done. We can change those attitudes. And I have a whole kind of stuff on women and STEM, and that's important because and I highlight on STEM just because STEM is one place where the gender wage gap is lower, and STEM is one place where the gender wage gap kind of exists because there are fewer women in the profession. The other piece, of course, is the leadership. Even when women are part of the mix, and even in STEM, there is a gender wage gap because there are fewer and fewer women as you go up the ranks. In fact, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, and we are proud to have a Benny in that group, but that group is really, really small, just 30 companies, 30 CEOs out of a whole list. And of course, it's interesting that some of these companies like Hershey or Health are again related to occupations where women are there. But then the very fact that in 2021 you can literally count the number of CEOs who are in this group, that's eye-opening. So, and then you can, again, I have more data in there, not necessarily going to repeat all of that, but there have been states like California taking a proactive stand as to having more women on boards. Because remember, women, again, are more than 50% of the US population. So women are consumers. Women are, they shop, they buy things, they make decisions, they choose schools, they make decisions for their children. And so it's important for companies to represent that diversity. So companies have taken a more proactive stand, but it still so happens that only 1 in 5 board members are women. And so, and many boards do not have women at all represented at all. So, we haven't talked about one thing in detail, and I don't think I can end this talk without talking about that thing. So, one of the things that's really important, pretty much central in my opinion to all of these conversations, is the fact that women in the economy are primarily still looked upon as child rearers, primary caregivers for their children. And you kind of see very clearly when you look at the gender wage gap among women with children under the age of 6 and women who are older. And it's also important, you might say, okay, so then as children grow up, the gender wage gap reduces. But it's also important to understand that most jobs, most high-paying jobs have a trajectory. So when women withdraw from the labor force, then they give up that trajectory. In my own occupation, for example, you are on a tenure track. If you withdraw from the tenure track, it's very, very rare that you can get back. Sometimes people do. Or think about law, or think about medicine. Think about all of those professions which require a lot of investment of time. It is very rarely that you can re-enter that same track. You can still do something, but those tracks are pretty harsh in terms of getting back. So you do see, and you can't, I wanted to show you something. So one of the main contributors of all of these numbers that we've seen is the withdrawal of women from the labor force, particularly in the prime ages, which often puts them out of the track. Now, why would women withdraw? No, income would give you more resources, more decision making. You probably can't see those numbers very well, and I don't intend for you to read all of them. But this is data from the BLS, the American Time Use Survey, which pretty much tells you how much time men and women spend on different activities. And of course, the largest part is sleep. But then you do see there are other issues about housework, for example. Let's pick that up. We can see that married fathers employed full-time, 0.22, and this is kind of work during a day, I believe, and it's the percentage of time spent on primary activities. And you kind of, and I'm not going to go into gory details about it, but it's important to see that in the economy, unpaid work and the amount of time men and women spend on unpaid work, especially with small children, is dramatically different. And not surprisingly, you have what Michelle Budig has called the maternal wall. That is, it certainly seems that marriage and children seem to be associated, I wouldn't say cause, associated with the fact that the gender wage gap exists, because right off college, yes, there is a gender wage gap because of the other factors we pointed out, but it seems to be a lot closer than comparing a mother's pay to father's pay. So we've established the problem. And now we briefly want to talk about COVID-19 and the fact that did it show us something new? And I'll give you the answer, spoiler, no. That's the red line is the male labor force participation rate, the blue line is the female, and we won't talk about why why male participation rates have been falling. And participation rate really refers to the percentage, and you can click on the link, so percentage of the population working or looking for work. And of course, as people go to college as well, that's also one reason for participation rates to fall, so it's not always a bad thing. But you do see that in our economy, in fact, I should zoom it to the 1970s, and you do see that women have been making strides in that labor force. And then, if you look at the pandemic, and that's February 2020, and you do see that the pandemic, basically, it led to both men and women withdrawing from the labor force, but disproportionately more so for women. Now, I won't go into the details of recessions in there, but what's important is part of the reason can be explained as to what women do. There are more, as we pointed out, occupational segregation, so more women are in front-facing jobs, more women are in hospitality and leisure and retail, and of course that contributed to part of it. But, and of course we must also point out the intersectionality piece here, because again, remember, the wage gap is lower for Black and Hispanic Americans, in large part because due to structural racism, Black and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately engaged in low-paying jobs. So there's a gap, the gap is lower, but everybody is earning less. But we do, and a lot of these women more so were in those front-facing jobs, and that disproportionately affected by COVID-19. In fact, the amount of unpaid work, very roughly, that women do in the United States compared to men is 1.6 times. COVID didn't create that. That's our societal decision. And therefore, and of course you can say Japan is worse, but that doesn't make us any better. And you can say the entire part of Asia is worse, and Africa is worse, and so on and so forth. So, but Canada is better. And so it's something to think about. And the graphic is kind of really cool. I found it this morning, but I couldn't make it bigger. But it kind of shows you the double tasking. So the important piece to remember is the pandemic did not create any new problems, and no economist or sociologist or political scientist or historian who's been working on this issue found it to be any surprise. But then as social scientists, when we look, these events unfortunately are the only experiments we have to verify what we already knew, unfortunately. And we kind of thought, yep, it is what it is. And we were not surprised. So now, how does the labor force participation connect with the gender wage gap? Can you tell me? Any connections? Well, both of those pieces effectively talk about attitudes, things that are, so for example, why do women do what they do? Why is unpaid work divided differently? Participation in paid work is connected to participation in unpaid work. So the gender wage gap, so simple economics might suggest, oh, there's a gender wage gap, so maybe more women should be hired. I think Jean pointed out that a student mentioned that women are cheaper to hire, so maybe labor force participation should go up because women are cheaper. I wish the world was so simple, but it's not. It's complicated, and in a way, the labor force participation rate and the gender wage gaps don't reinforce each other. So the big question for us is, what do we do about it? This has been the case for a long time. Any ideas? I have some ideas there. And so, of course, the most, and it's important to understand there's a lot of resentment about policy. Whenever we hear, oh, big government is getting into my life, etc., the government has always got into our lives. It's big, and we elect the government because we wanted to create structure which individuals cannot. So that's very important. In the 1970s, when women joined the labor market in droves, there were definite reasons that supported that. Right now, the United States, unfortunately, is pretty much alone among every other developed and even almost all developing countries in not having any sort of child care policy. And child care policies can be of various kinds. Care for small children, subsidized by the government, parental leave as given to both parents, tax cuts, subsidies. We do have some of those pieces in there, more so in recent times. But, and there was room. And so remember I said that the United States stands alone with these two tiny countries in having no universal childcare policy at all at the federal level. Many of you may work for companies which for their own sake have such policies, and it's important. Companies are not, they're not necessarily kind of, companies are not necessarily being generous when they offer parental leave, and in fact, one of the reasons why they do so is to retain good workers who are otherwise going to leave the labor force because of childcare. Now, of course, we did have an opportunity in recent, and I'm an economist, so I'm not a politician. So we did have an opportunity, fortunately, in recent days, to actually provide for childcare so that the United States would not be in this list anymore. But of course, yesterday, this was the first thing that we got rid of. We do have, we do have some useful things, again, universal preschool for children, which is provided for not only K through 12, that's a good piece. We do have some childcare support and so on and so forth. But many of you will know, or will unfortunately come to know, that daycare costs are one of the most important reasons why women withdraw from the labor force. And so, and therefore, and of course, we don't have, so you might say, why should I pay for somebody else's kids? You know, I don't have to. But it's important for us as a society to have resources for Social Security. My Social Security depends on you getting jobs, because I am paying for the Social Security of individuals who are in the labor market right now. And that's how Social Security works. And your Social Security depends on the next generation paying towards the Social Security fund. So we need taxes, right? As a society, if we just say, oh, taxes are bad, well, we have to provide for our own roads and have our own funding for K through 12 education. We have to, and of course, we have to have our own national parks and so on and so forth. So it's extremely important to get rid of a very sort of constricted idea that any sort of taxes are bad, because taxes help us as a society. And so do children. In fact, and this is a profit-making company, the Standard & Poor, who estimates that if we were to support more women entering the labor force, the economy would actually benefit from that. And if you did research on the growth of the US economy, particularly in the 60s and 70s, in large part it was due to the growth of female labor force participation rates, which are falling now. So the question is, and this is where I'm going to end, can we afford to not care? Well, one of the things that you may or may not be aware is our population growth rate is shrinking. Fertility growth rates are shrinking. In fact, our birth rates are at the lowest level that they are. And you might say, why should I care about the birth rate? But then, as the age of having first child increases, and in fact that's an average, and it's interesting, even, and it's somewhere online, and I can share that with you. You can actually type in a zip code, and you can see the age of having a first child, and that even within Minnesota, it's about 3 years more in the Twin Cities area compared to the St. Cloud area. And that also tells you that as women enter the labor force, as women want to maintain jobs, it makes more sense for them to postpone childbearing, simply because it's often an either-or decision. And it shouldn't be an either-or decision, because women and men both gain if there are additions to society. Of course, there are other ways to add to society, but I'm going to leave it at that. So, of course, just to repeat, it was, and this is yesterday. yesterday, which is why I wanted my presentation to update here. And in fact, today, where it was confirmation that we decided that we're going to shelve childcare for another time, which is sad. But on that sad note, I will end.
All right, let's start with students. What questions or comments? That was a lot of information and really important for thinking about the gender and work and a range of different issues. Is there a particular piece that stood out for you of your question about, or you would just like her to kind of go back to and explain for you a little bit more?
So I think it was your second to last slide. It said that in 2010 the average age of first birth was 23, and then recently it was 27. That just seems like a really fast rate of change to me. Do you know if there's any one factor you can find that kind of contributed to that sudden massive change over the past decade?
Actually, Will, that is the topic of my sabbatical too. And so, and that's an important question. Well, of course, there are one part, of course, is the average age of first birth is increasing. Fertility rates are decreasing. Now, historically, the United States has managed to keep young economy relative to its peers in Canada or Western Europe by immigration too. And because immigrants are more likely to have larger families, they're likely to be younger, and that has kept the economy going. And we've also had restrictive immigration policies. But one of the important things that feminist economists have pointed out is, again, this either or choice. Now, fertility is really, it's complex because in any society, as individuals become richer, the opportunity cost of having more children increases. So fertility is bound to go up as income increases. Now, you want to make it easier for people to have children and support children, which is why Europe has long gone into a policy of subsidized childcare and parental leaves. Even in many European countries, particularly in Northern Europe, even designating leave for paternity leave as well as maternity leave, so it's not really taken by one parent alone. So I would say it's a combination of those factors, the fact that we've had a more restrictive immigration policy than before in recent years. And the other piece is, again, we've not made it easier. Daycare is even in the state of Minnesota, where daycare, particularly, in some places Minnesota, daycare is not even available. In other places, even if it's available, it's extremely expensive. So the economic decision is for the partner earning less to not participate in the labor market. And typically, because of the gender wage gap, that partner is the woman. Though it's important to point out that in 41% of US households, women are the primary earners. So it's not okay to say that it's always men. And so when women postpone, part of it is, again, education, part of it is, again, entering occupations where there's a trajectory. And because it's this either or choice that women have to play, and it's kind of, it's pretty concerning, but it is something that we could, I think, ignore up until the Great Recession, but up to beyond that point, we haven't been able to. Yeah. Yes.
Can I just add to that? I also think it's the delay of marriage.
Mm-hmm.
That, it used to be women would get married right out of high school, then college got required, and you put your 4 years into college, you want to get some experience, in your area of expertise, and we have more and more kids going on to grad school. So, I've seen even in the time that I started teaching here, we had lots of students getting married right after they graduated from college. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know who I am yet, or I want to travel the world a little bit more, or I want to go to grad school. And so I think that also has pushed that first birth back farther.
Thank you, Sheila. For the students, I think it's just really great. We have an economist, we have a sociologist, we have a historian, we have a couple of political scientists. transfer, and I think it's important because this is such an interdisciplinary question. Just some of those questions you were saying, can I explain, why women are gravitating towards some jobs than others? I can and I can't explain that. It's many disciplines are trying to understand these issues, and economics has a particular strength for that, and then these other disciplines kind of contribute to the conversation. Yeah. Other questions?
You mentioned, thank you so much for your talk and stuff, and you also mentioned a lot about how childcare is obviously extremely expensive, and that's one of the biggest reasons that women aren't in the workforce, and that multiple different European and highly developed countries are subsidizing childcare. Why do you think that the United States hasn't followed suit, and what would you recommend they do to follow suit and catch up on that?
I would probably take a couple of hours, but well, primarily because our, and again, we have excellent colleagues and they can add to this, because what I've understood is attitudes play a very important role. In the US economy, we have this attitude which is really good in some ways, where we think we are self-made and we want to make our own decisions. I don't want the government to do this and do that. Unfortunately, we do. I mean, Medicare, Medicaid, roads, bridges, all of this is government, but we don't want the government, and then we have this whole myth of government spending not increasing. But the point is, the government is not an individual, and the U.S. government, fortunately, I'm not advocating debt, but I'm just trying to say that the U.S. government, people want to lend to the U.S. because the U.S. government is the most powerful government in the world by far. I mean, but they're not. So what we should do is to boost the ability of that government to remain powerful, which is why you have to have, like I said, men and women are both dropping out of the labor force for different reasons. And particularly for women, it seems to be a shame, because women are attaining skills in larger numbers. And as an economist, you know that, and this is just common sense, you don't have to be an economist, that we shouldn't be wasting skills. And so we're not using them. And so we can actually, but then again, we've been reluctant to increase taxes on people who they won't even notice if you increase taxes on them. They're like, okay, some chunk change missing. And it doesn't seem to make much sense in, and I think our reluctance is also not understanding what would be if we, so for example, the government has been subsidizing childcare subsidies have been provided to people, and it's kind of being automatically accounted for. So some of those things, just like the Affordable Care Act, people do not really understand. And I think the policymakers, particularly people who propose these policies, don't do a good enough job in advocating. Am I right, Pedro? I'm a little, or Christy, do you like to add something about policymakers?
It's interesting because people sometimes think we can't have universal childcare because they can't envision it, but we have a model. The U.S. military provides childcare, so there are models that exist. We just don't want to pay for it, and then that gets into all kinds of policymaker ideas, which I'm totally out of my wheelhouse here, but about how the mother is the nurturer, and so God forbid somebody else nurture your child, even though that's been done since the beginning of time.
And of course, Emily left, but right up her alley, just barely 23% of Congress is even made up of people who could technically even face this problem. And therefore, I have issues with Senator Gillibrand, but one of the things that she always does is she fights for this, and she's experienced that. So you also need different people in government, people who can kind of identify with these issues. So I think it just makes a lot of practical sense, but we haven't had it because we have politicians who misguide us all the time. I'm sorry, I couldn't say it better.
I just wanted to see if we had one more question.
Did you want to add to that, Shannon?
Oh, I was just going to say the U.S. did it during World War II.
Yep.
Provided
Yep.
child care centers for women to go to work, and then it became more convenient to pull those women out of the workforce so the men could take those jobs. And then they said, nope, we're not gonna subsidize this anymore.
Really important to have those historical and contemporary perspectives, right, on something that we otherwise act like it's impossible for us to do here, even though it's done everywhere except I think 3 countries in the world, right?
And those countries are, they're important, but they're literally, maybe one of them actually even put something in place recently. So, yeah, that's pretty shameful.
Is there a last question?
But of course, I should add, this is federal paid leave. So like I said, many of you will work for companies which for their own sake will pay generous parental leave. And we all know that companies are, at the end of the day, motivated by profit. So they're not doing any good to you, but generally they'll train you. They want you to be there. And so it's a shame for them to have you drop out and not keep contributing. So that's important, but it's important to understand that, again, disproportionately this affects workers at the lower end of the labor force, disproportionately more. And the COVID numbers kind of point that out too.
And those are good questions to ask when you're applying for a job,
Mhm.
if you have the privilege of
Absolutely.
having more than one job offer or one job that's viable for you.
Great point, of course. I didn't ask that question at St. Ben's and St. John's, and we didn't. I was just lucky enough to have my daughter in summer, so. Or we didn't.
Can I say something with that? XP does have a link online about salary negotiation to help you navigate that whenever you're thinking about job offers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for speaking. If you have